مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. صنع السياسات ليس أمرا سهلا. على مدار 50 عاما الأخيرة أنشأت أبرز الجامعات العريقة في بلادنا كليات خاصة تركز فقط على تدريب الرجال والنساء على صنع السياسات. تخرج الآلاف وشغلوا مناصب في الحكومة، ولكن التحدي المتمثل في صنع سياسة ذكية وفعالة لم يزد سهولة. يطرح الشرق الأوسط مجموعة فريدة من التحديات. ما مدى أهمية المنطقة؟ ما هي المصالح الأميركية هناك؟ ما هي التحديات الحقيقية لتلك المصالح؟ هل نملك استراتيجية للتصدي لتلك التحديات؟ هل تلك الاستراتيجية مثمرة؟ كم يكلفنا الفشل؟ كم يكلفنا النجاح؟ هذه بعض من الأسئلة التي يتعين على الرجال والنساء المسؤولين عن السياسة الخارجية الأمريكية الإجابة عليها. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنطرح هذه الأسئلة على اللجنة تضم خبيرين من خبراء الأمن القومي هما ريتشارد فاونتين وجون أمبل. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today we're talking about the making of American foreign policy with a focus on the Middle East with our guests Richard Fontaine and John Amble. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with the most basic question. How important is the Middle East, this region of the world, to America today, 2015? Richard, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's critical to the United States, and part of the evidence for this is the Obama administration has wanted to rebalance its foreign policy to Asia. But if you measure the importance of a region by the amount of time and attention that policymakers are giving to it, then the Middle East consumes huge amounts of time by the President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense. We have troops on the ground in the Middle East. We have terrorism in the Middle East. We have support for our friends and partners in the Middle East, like Israel and the Gulf countries. And we have Iran in the Middle East, with which we're engaged in deep negotiation over its nuclear program. So all of these kinds of issues are front and center on the policymakers' plates right now.
And does the Middle East deserve all this time and attention, John?
Sure, I think so. There are a number of issues that affect the Middle East, that play out in the Middle East and affect the Middle East, and those are debatable about whether or not the U.S. should have an interest in resolving them. But there are also issues in each sphere, be it the military and security sphere, the economic sphere, or the political sphere, that transcend borders, that reach out, that we can't avoid. They're going to affect us, so we need to do what we can to try to be involved in them, to participate in the processes that deliver the ultimate outcomes.
President Obama has identified a number of interests in the Middle East. That's his list of American interests in the Middle East. What's your list? Or at least what are the top 3 or so interests that you would identify for America in this part of the world?
Stability, number one, and everything else kind of revolves around that. Stability, security is a function of stability. Terrorism is a function of security. Politics and social grievances drive issues that certainly can reach out and affect us. So I think that's really what it comes down to, is stability, both in a sort of in a regional sense, in that governments generally get along with each other, but also in kind of a sub-state sense on a cultural and societal level.
Richard, how would you list your top interests in the Middle East?
Well, I put energy on the table, the free flow of oil and gas from the Middle East. I would also add the threat of terrorism and keeping that as contained as possible, so that the United States, either in the homeland or Americans abroad or their partners abroad, don't suffer terrorist attacks. I'd also put the promotion of democracy and human rights on the table as well as an interest, because I think there's a connection between that and the terrorism threat and the stability of the region. And so Those would be three that I would put on the table.
There's been some debate about your last point over the last decade. Do you concur that that deserves to be up in the top three?
I think it's something that should be on our radar. Whether or not that should drive policy is maybe is different. And if you asked a lot of very smart people that have valuable opinions this question in 2010, pre-Arab Spring, and say now, post-Arab Spring, where we've seen shifts in the way we treat the promotion of democracy, say in Egypt, for instance, and you've seen how little we can actually impact how political processes play out in those countries, and we can get burned if we're seen to be doing so too much. So yes, of course, I think the Middle East is a better region if there are more democratic institutions, and I think that it's important. I don't know that we'll go back to an era where that is a driving force in our policy.
So if these are our interests, what would you identify as the biggest threats to our interests? And how would you rank them? Because there's a great debate here in Washington about what are the biggest threats to us.
Right. I think, well, the sort of overarching threat I think that we're seeing right now is the disintegration of the regional order and the underlying state system in some parts of the Middle East. There's some parts where the state system and the order is totally fine. But if you look at Libya, Syria, Iraq, the fundamental borders that have been in place for 100 years are now starting to come apart for a variety of different reasons. So that is what I would say kind of overlaying this. But the threat of ISIS is and terrorism in the Middle East is one that obviously galvanizes the attention of policymakers in Washington to a degree that we are taking active military steps and increasing what we are doing to combat them. And then I think Iran's role in the region is one of deep concern. It should be deep concern to Americans and also to our partners in the region. And so I would put sort of the threat of ISIS and the threat of Iran there at the top.
And would you agree with that assessment, or would you prioritize them a little differently?
No, sure. I think that those are the two, and related in many ways. If we're talking about ways to deal with these threats, for instance, if our plan to combat ISIS is predicated heavily on, say, arming and training Sunni tribes, well, that plays into our relationship with Baghdad, who's very much influenced by Iran, and we might, in order to assuage Baghdad so that Iran doesn't get angry and walk away from the negotiating table, have to shift our policy in how we deal with ISIS. So I think certainly those are the two most, and they impact each other, and they impact other things. I think in a more general sense, volatility, another wild card kind of thrown into the deck. As Richard said, we've been trying to shift to Asia for quite some time, and every time we try, we get kind of pulled back to something else. And there's just such a basket of issues that the U.S. government is trying to not necessarily deal with, but manage and be at least aware of. That a wild card, a new regime falls or a coup in one country. One country decides to start. Dealing with the problem in a different way, changing a shift of course, that makes things a lot more difficult for us. So I think volatility generally is something that is a big threat.
Okay, when we come back after the break, I'm going to ask John and Richard to take a look at our strategy, focusing on Iraq and Syria, and see how well we're doing in just a moment. Our panel today includes John Amble. John is the managing editor of an insightful blog called War on the Rocks, a platform for analysis, commentary, and debate on foreign policy and national security issues through a realist lens. It features articles by top-notch scholars who study war, those who have served or worked in war zones, and some who have done it all. John himself is a doctoral candidate at King's College London, where his research examines the role of local context in shaping the identities of regional militant Islamist groups. A former U.S. Army intelligence officer and veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, John holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree from King's College in London. Sitting to his left is Richard Fontaine. Richard is the president of the Center for New American Security, a prominent Washington think tank. Before joining the Institute, He served for 5 years as foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, including as foreign policy advisor to the senator's 2008 presidential campaign, and then as minority deputy staff director on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Previously, he served as associate director for Near East policy at the National Security Council, and he also worked in the NSC's Asian Affairs Directorate, where he covered Southeast Asian issues. A native of New Orleans, Richard received his bachelor's degree from Tulane University and his master's from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies here in our nation's capital. So let's look at Iraq, a country where 4 successive presidents have sent Americans to fight. If a Martian were looking at this, they would be wondering what's really going on. If we're at war, we're not fighting. If we're not fighting, why are we at war? How does one supposed to understand what the strategy is? Richard?
Well, there are really, on the military side in Iraq, there are 2 elements to the U.S. strategy right now. The first is the heavy use of air power to bomb ISIS targets, and the other is to train Iraqis to go off of the bases and fight ISIS. The combination of that does not appear to me to be succeeding. The fall of Ramadi, the capital of Anbar province, to ISIS, as well as gains ISIS has made in Syria together, suggest to me that we are not doing enough to contain and then roll back ISIS's gains. The president has said that the goal is to ultimately defeat ISIS, and how we can do that through a combination of training relative handfuls of Iraqis on military bases and air power of the sort that we've been employing. To me, I don't see how those things connect. The other piece is the political side of this, which is to encourage the Iraqi government to bring Sunnis more into the fold and try to reduce the attractions of ISIS as a champion for Sunni fortunes. That is much easier said than done. President Abadi is much better than his predecessor, but he has a long legacy of very deep mistrust to try to overcome, as well as entrenched factions on the Shia side within Iraq.
So, do you gentlemen think that this strategy will ultimately succeed? That we currently have
I do not think that this strategy will ultimately succeed.
You do not
I
think
do not
so?
think so.
John, what do you think?
I don't think so either, and I think a big part of that is because for this type of conflict, the U.S. military is very much built around something we call the targeting cycle, which integrates kind of the intelligence and kinetic operational aspects of everything that we do. And so they talk about, we call it F3EAD, find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate. And so that means that every target that gets hit then ultimately provides intelligence that leads to more targets. And that's something that for this type of conflict, this is how we do it. And we don't have sufficient forces there to have those kind of communications channels with enough bandwidth to be able to keep driving operations. And so I think we're struggling a little bit. I think we've got enough people there to do some things, but we're not entirely sure what they should be doing.
So what would you do to fix it if victory is to remain our goal?
I don't think a widespread reinvasion is certainly not politically palatable. The phrase boots on the ground is has become almost a curse word in some senses. I think that we need to be able to reach out a little bit. We can reach out from at 30,000 feet with fighter bombers and hit with airstrikes and drone strikes. We're not reaching out deeply enough into ISIS territory and into the front lines with U.S. assets. So I think that probably ultimately special forces, probably some of the special forces groups that spent almost a decade operating in these regions already and have that sort of institutional expertise and relationships, which is also important. I think that ultimately that's the only way that this current strategy kind of takes a turn towards success.
Some additional deployment of special forces.
Mm-hmm. Limited, but additional.
Richard?
Well, I think you've got the military side and then the political side. On the military side, I think having forward air controllers to do spotting for airstrikes off of the U.S. bases. I think embedding special operations forces at the battalion level so that they can stiffen the backbone of Iraqi units, close air support for Iraqi units in the field that are coming under fire, from you can use U.S. helicopters and things like that. So I think some of those things on the military side could make a difference. And then on the political side, trying to integrate our political approach with the military side, which is something we have learned how to do in Iraq. It's not easy, but to link some of the military operations to the things that we're pushing the Iraqis to do. Not sort of overarching necessarily pass this law or reform your way of doing this, but other things like, you know, the flow of money to the West in Iraq, or the flow of money to the Kurds, and trying to bring the country back together at least a little bit so as to reduce the attractions of ISIS. But even if we do everything we said here, it still may not work because, you know, we are choosing among bad options and trying to identify the least bad option.
And we're choosing among those options because we put limitations on what we're willing to bear in order to achieve the goal.
Yes, I mean, to some degree. I mean, we, you know, theoretically, we could, you know, have a draft and send 1 million men in to take Anbar province, and I think we would probably succeed in that endeavor. But really, I think the fundamental challenge is this is a big, tough problem, and yes, we're not willing to reinvade Iraq. No one wants to do that, to send, you know, large numbers of ground units in to retake territory and then stay there forever. And so you look at these other options to work through and with the Iraqis to try to help them help themselves, and then you have a much more limited set of options, but that more limited set of options is also less likely to be successful.
And so the president, when he first laid out this strategy, he said it will be 3 years to achieve his goal. Do you think that's realistic?
I think there's one thing that we've found in the past decade and a half. It's that it's very difficult to apply timelines in the Middle East. It's very difficult to apply timelines in international politics and international affairs generally, but especially in the Middle East, because there are so many wildcard factors. I think that at this stage, I would say no. I don't think that the strategy, as it is currently laid out and based on how it's likely to evolve, is likely to have to be deemed a success after 3 years.
Our allies in the region aren't so excited about this strategy. Probably for very different reasons. To what extent, generally, should we be looking to our allies, taking their advice? Should they be partners in the formation of a strategy? Should they be the bankers of a strategy? What role should we envision for our local partners, our local allies, in this sort of fight?
Well, I think we're always stronger when we go into this kind of fight with allies, and that can mean a variety of different things. It can mean allies that are involved in the planning of these things. It can be allies that are simply giving us their advice based on their knowledge of the situation on the ground or the international situation. It can be you know, resources, financial, military, otherwise. So I think we always are stronger when we do that. The one thing that one has to avoid is merely having allies that will exhort America to do more, complain when America doesn't do everything they want, and then they are not willing to actually do the things that we are not doing. You know, we can't sort of fight to the last American until every one of our partners in the region or anywhere else in the world is satisfied, because that won't. So, you know, there has to be a mutual respect and sense of reality about what can actually be accomplished within a given time frame, given the resources the United States and our partners have.
And what's your experience and your view on and how we should relate to our allies and partners in this sort of fight?
I think ultimately there's also the question of legitimacy, particularly because, you know, the dominant conflict, at least in, you know, common appreciation, in the dominant issue and security threat certainly in the Middle East right now is ISIS, at least today, and in a very immediate sense. And the reason, you know, going back to what we were talking about before, and why the U.S. why U.S. popular opinion or public opinion has kind of shifted in favor of some sort of action against ISIS. We talked about, you know, sort of very violent acts of theirs. But I think a bigger part is the radicalization and recruitment amongst American civilians. The same reason many Western European countries are interested in that. And so if you look at it as kind of an ISIS and a radicalization issue, I mean, the key tenet of jihadist propaganda, be it ISIS or Al-Qaeda or various regional militant groups, is the U.S. is a neo-imperialist actor, probably acting in the interest of Israel, and for that reason they need to be fought. So I think we need to be very careful when we're in a region that is a potential tinderbox of radicalization, radical ideas, that we are perceived to be acting with legitimacy. And I think that partners do a great deal to lend that to us to some extent.
Well, gentlemen, there's a lot more we could go on in here, because I think we've exposed how difficult it is to come up with strategy, certainly effective strategy, in dealing with this topic. Thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. John, Richard.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول أهمية الشرق الأوسط بالنسبة للسياسة الخارجية الأميركية، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.